Hello my friends, Tyler here, and this is Game Life. Yesterday we talked about different types of progression. Today I wanted to look at cost-based progression. Normally it is associated with grinds. It can become very grindy. Let's look at how we can avoid bad grinds. First things first, we have a problem. Cost-based progression can become grindy. Some examples of this, and we're going to be using Minecraft as an example. The reason for this is because it's a survival game, and usually early on in survival games, you are going to be having a cost-based progression model. One of the first things you do is you want to build a house, but that requires material, which is an item that you have to give up in order to progress. Another thing is farming, which takes time, and that's time you have to give up in order to progress. So the solutions to this, and these are just ones we're picking. You could try to solve this problem with different solutions, but I picked these three: partition, gameplay, mesh and meld, and reimburse. Let's take a deeper look at these solutions. First things first is partition. So partition is when we take our grind time. We have all this grind time, and we're going to try to break it up into smaller pieces. They don't all have to be the same size, but we want it into small pieces. If we left it as it is, it's still the same thing. I mean, just because we're breaking it up doesn't mean that it's not just the same thing as over here. So we haven't done anything yet. We're not complete. Next, we have to mesh and meld. So we take some interesting segments of gameplay. Interesting is just something that's rare or engaging, maybe risky, which could also be rewarding, or even negative. And what we are going to do is we're going to put those segments that are interesting in between the segments that are grindy, and we'll end up with something like this. Remember, this is the time that people are going to spend playing the game. Some parts are going to be grindy, and some parts are going to be interesting. Something to note is because these are unequal segments, they don't know how long they're going to be grinding or how long they're going to be doing something that's interesting. So that also creates a little bit of suspense, which helps break up the grinding process. Now we have to reimburse. So we see here, these are both equal in the length of time that they're going to be doing something, both of these right here. On this side though, once we've mesh and meld, they have less time that they're grinding, which means they have less time that they're getting the resources they need. We solve this by making a similar amount of time give a similar amount of reward. On average, these interesting segments are going to need to give a reasonable reward to offset the displacement of resource gaining that a player would be doing. And again, this doesn't have to be equal either. Some segments could give huge rewards. Some segments could detract a little bit away and actually cost the player some. And then some could give just average rewards, and then some could just be interesting but not really give any rewards. All it needs to do is average amount over a reasonable time duration. In our agitators, we have the example of building a house requiring materials and farming taking time. Let's look at those in depth and see how those were alleviated with our solution. So for resource gathering, the way you gather a resource for your house is you chop down a tree, you punch that tree, and that's about it. However, we need to partition. We see here we've partitioned the grind into smaller chunks, mix in some interesting bits. Here we have some mixed in interesting bits, and make the reward about equal so that they are reimbursed for the time they lose having to deal with those interesting, fun parts of the game. For example, apples can drop, and those are rare items that will let you craft useful items later on. So that's going to be an extra benefit. They spend a little bit of time going and collecting the item, but it's useful to them. Since we're giving them a lot of usefulness with that apple, we're also going to give them a negative interesting moment, which is when their axe breaks. Now, negative isn't necessarily a bad thing to do. It creates some emotions, which is what games are trying to do, is invoke emotions and give experiences. So when you're playing the game and your axe breaks, that might spook you if you weren't prepared for it, or maybe you'll have to go run back and get a new axe, make one out of the tree that you were just chopping down, but it breaks up the monotony of chopping down tree after tree after tree. The other example we had was that farming takes time. So we partition the grind from planting and harvesting and waiting, but instead of just sitting around waiting, we can actually fill that time with any other activity the player wants to do in the game by allowing them to leave the area and treat the time that it takes and the time they have to spend as sort of a passive thing that they don't need to actively sit there and do. So they fill that time, that grind, with any activity they want, which will have its own rewards. That breaks up the monotony of farming. So all a player has to do is have a little bit of a grind with planting, and then they go do some other activity, anything they want, which if they were forced to just sit around and watch the farm grow, that would be part of the grind, and we'd have to solve that, but it solves itself by having them go do anything else they want, and then they have to come back and grind a little bit to have some harvesting. That successfully breaks everything up, and so we started with a problem. Cost-based progression is really grindy sometimes, and it can be boring and take away from a player experience. So we want to solve that, and we do that by taking the grinding and breaking it into segments. We mix it up with segments of interest, and we reward them with fair compensation, and that'll help break up that monotony and make cost-based progression more of a viable option when we're making our game, instead of being something that actually takes away from the whole experience. I hope you enjoyed this little discussion of how to fix some of our progression. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.